Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and as you can see, what's going on here isn't your typical worm maintenance, worm bin maintenance type activity. It's a little fancy schmancier than that. I'm still trying to work out the kinks on some of the things I've got set up here, but I'm about to start into a new experiment. I just thought I'd do a little lead in on it before it actually gets set up. So I'm going to do one or more two tests, then we're going to get a glove on and get to work on this bin, and then you'll see where all this stuff comes into play. So let's get to work. Alright, so what we've got here is my 264-day-old African nightcrawler system. Those 264 days consisted of an initial 200 days worth of composting, followed up by 6 weeks, 42 days of what I refer to as foraging, no food at all, and then the initiation of migration of the worms, trying to lure them out of their finished compost, a process which has been going probably a little bit longer than it needs to have been for 22 days now. So I got a funny feeling that when we go in there to see what's going on, most of the worms in the system might be over in the feeding area, which is over here underneath the plastic. But then again, who knows? A lot of times when I predict that a lot of worms are going to react nicely to my migration attempts, I end up finding most of them back in the finished compost, paying no attention to the new food and bedding that was set up. But really quick, before I dismantle what's here, somebody had talked about how my use of a great number of pieces of napkin, paper towel, toilet paper, tissue paper, some of these lighter, softer type papers, perhaps because they're more airy, perhaps have a greater air content or ability to bring air in. I don't know, I was told that they would actually cause a great deal of warmth or heat, and I just happen to have a couple of these thermometers that came with one of my composting science kits, my 3-chamber system that I used in one of my fairly well-known time lapses. Came with three Celsius reading thermometers, and I figured I could pit the refit of our feeding area, horizontal migration feeding area in this case, to put a thermometer into one side and onto the other side, and one side would be rich in these types of papers, which supposedly when put into the feeding area of a worm bin would get really, really hot, versus just using my normal everyday mix of shredded cardboard and paper and I guess, leaves, a mix of carbon-based bedding materials that are maybe just a little bit more dense and tough than those softer types that we're testing to see if they warm up. So the worm chow is going to also be part of what I use to set up the reset of this feeding area. 22 days, I've resisted the urge to peek under the plastic, so this plastic is the way it was when we last left it. But before we get over there, let me just show you why this was set this way. I wanted to run a time lapse so that the time lapse camera, whatever the camera would be of choice, would watch the two thermometers and see if the temperatures change evenly or unevenly. And I figured if we were expecting one of the sides to go hotter, which I guess is the paper, napkin, tissue side, I'd use this red coin to indicate that that's where we predict higher temperatures coming through. So I thought that would be our marker. And the little test I ran earlier was just to see if the action camera that I've got or this old smartphone that I've got would work better. And it wasn't a big surprise that the smartphone produced a somewhat better, easier to see result on showing where the reading on the thermometers were. So I'm going to be going with that camera. And this was really just here to protect the camera setup from getting soiled. And that brings us to a point where now things are fairly familiar from a worm bin maintenance perspective. And I watched another person's video, Plant Obsessed's video the other day, or it was earlier today actually, showing where she was catching up on one of her systems, a couple of her systems that haven't been checked in on in quite some time. She got caught up on vacation, didn't get home for quite some time, was just finally getting around to checking in on her systems after about a month's inactivity from the perspective of getting check-ins and feedings. I'm sure there was a lot of activity within the systems in her absence. And I'm kind of feeling the same way here. Going more than 3 weeks to not check in on a horizontal migration is really out of sorts for me. So it is really beautiful what's happening over here. All these freshly deposited castings. I did actually try to separate what had been the finished castings in the system versus the feeding area with a piece of cardboard that I stuck in here, but I was getting this funny feeling that we would see no sign of that either. I mean, there's really no easy way to distinguish, I believe, what I had started with initially 22 days ago, which was all the castings pushed over to this side, versus what's happened in the feeding zone. Because I don't see any leftovers yet. Okay, finally. I knew there'd have to be something eventually. Some sort of a larger chunk of paper. This actually doesn't look like paper. It's actually the peel of some cantaloupe melon. That's what it is. I guess that's why it lasted. Paper seems like it might not have had a chance to last in here, because I'm seeing the only thin stuff that I saw was, melon peel, melon skin. This is a tough something, some sort of stem of something. I think broccoli may have been one of the things that were used in here. So this tougher chunk here appears to have maybe survived the onslaught of the worms coming into the feeding area. If I was going to be doing a haul out today, I guess I'd be careful not to let worms kind of escape me by running back into the finished compost or something. But at this point, I think we're just going to be resetting. We're not doing any hauling out. It's really just to get this migration zone restarted after me just not having the opportunity to get back here in a more timely fashion. And I also kind of like the idea of doing this temperature test by trying bedding A versus bedding B. And it will be interesting to see, because I don't think I've heard an observation like that before, but I did happen to have a pretty good collection of paper materials that were meant for composting anyway, that kind of matched the description of what had been talked about there. Napkins and tissues and paper towels, things like that. And this system seemed like it would also be due for a check-in after more than 3 weeks. So it seemed like perhaps the perfect place to do such a trial of bedding types, one versus the other. But you could see there's virtually nothing left of the bedding or the food that had been set up for them on this edge of the bin. There was a completely brand new setup put in here, on this edge. We're finding one or two larger chunks of newspaper, perhaps, some sorts of paper here and there, but and the cantaloupe melon rinds like these right here. Kind of like a slightly tougher material. But it too would be gone in some time, in a couple more weeks, I think, if there was nothing else going on in here. But we're going to be resetting the feeding area. I already showed you the worm chest, so here's a little bundle of worms hanging out, enjoying these pieces of melon or whatever little bits of food remain on those scraps of melon. Just so many castings that the worms that are all gathered here don't seem like that many because of all the castings. They're just blending right in. So here, I did do a little excavation to see if I could find a somewhat hot spot of perhaps a few extra worms hanging out together to give us a sense of what kind of turnout this produced. But I believe that the castings themselves and the absence of any sort of leftovers hardly, other than just a few tougher, larger materials, is clear evidence that the worms came out in force to feast on the nice new setup that they'd received after all that foraging. They were definitely ready for some fresh bedding and fresh food. So I think that when we do a reset here, since a lot of them are over here already, they'll just come right over, and hopefully it'll also help to continue the evacuation of the castings on the other edge, which I guess I'm also curious of. So before we reset on this edge, I believe, now that we've fished out some of the materials we're going to recycle in the reset, I'd like to get a sense of how our depopulation after 22 days of the finished castings in the system is coming along too. Before I put all the camera rig stuff on there to do this exposure and camera test, I did actually place that newspaper on there to kind of protect that mount that the cameras were on. And before that was on there, the finished castings were just exposed to the air, and you can even see they're quite dry just from the look of them. They're pretty light in color, and they're dried out pretty good. I've not probed into that yet either, so I was really resisting the urge to check out how things are going on in here, but I wanted to be systematic about it, and I figured let's experience what's happening here together as we move forward. So I think the next thing is going to be for me to just pull all this recycled stuff out so that when we're ready to rebuild the feeding area, we can easily. But I'd still like to inspect here first, so this container will do me fine here. Plenty of space in here to put all the gathered large chunks of leftovers of bedding and food, of which there really isn't much. And I guess if any more surface while we're probing around in here, a little more stem of broccoli right there. Another little scrap of cantaloupe skin, but that's about it, I think, in here. If I see anything else, we can add it to this collection. But this is where we're resetting anyway, so it'll be coming back into the same general area. If we leave some out, it doesn't matter. Let's just take a look to see how the finished castings are coming along from the perspective of depopulation and migration. Because, you know, perhaps there's not a whole lot left here. This is kind of more at the perimeter. And it does, you know, if memory serves me, I believe the partition was somewhere over here in terms of all the freshly added stuff versus the existing bin. So it does seem like a lot of worms right here at the perimeter. And I don't know if that just means that's what we're going to see all the way through into the other edge. And if it is, then it's kind of nice because it's super densely packed with worms. Almost as if it were more densely packed with worms than the side that had been fed and baited for migration. And that's sometimes one of my main theories lately, is that as much as I would want to create an awesome, tempting place for the worms to be lured or attracted over to, if what they're in already is suiting them well enough and is comfortable and cozy from a food source and moisture perspective as what we're seeing in here, then there might be minimal reason for the worms to want to exit the finished castings over into the newly set up feeding area. And to me, it just seems like drying is the one way that you can get a little bit more activity out of the worms. Once they sense the material that they're in starting to dry, it becomes sort of like an alarm bell, fire drill, time to go find something better if it's available. And if right here on the other edge of the bin you're setting up something that's just that, then if they stumble on it, once they get moving, they'll stay. So I'm definitely curious to see what stuff looks like over on this edge. Kind of scraping up the most dry stuff out on the top surface, but it's so far probably not much more than just the thickness of my hand that I've scraped back. I'll scrape back perhaps an equal amount, now perhaps as thick as my fist. Haven't really gone very deep yet, not even halfway down yet, I believe. Just trying to get a sense overall as far as worms throughout the material relative to the, you know, this edge where we've been. You saw the plastic was kind of hanging out pretty good, so it really did intentionally spill over past the section that had been rebuilt over onto the existing castings. So I knew that the existing castings right up on the edge of the migration zone would be a little bit more damp than the rest because of the plastic coverings. I guess the whole idea of that was that the plastic coverings would force recirculation and that the castings would be giving up some of their moisture to dampen the freshly added, relatively drier bedding. And it must have done a great job at that because it caused the worms to come on over and chew most all of it up, with the exception of the few little scraps that we collected over here, little bits of newspaper, little bits of food scraps. But let's really get a better sense at this point, going all the way through down to the bottom of what we're dealing with here. It does seem like we're really nowhere, if you ask me, in terms of migrating the worms, unless maybe they came over for what had been there, and once it, you know, was depleted, maybe they just returned to the finished castings. It's hard to say, but it does seem to me like there's really no drop in worm count in this material. It's super densely populated with a whole bunch of worms. So all I'm doing is attempting to aerate the material, crumble it up a little bit, possibly move some of the more damp stuff to the surface, and if possible, submerge some of the drier material that had been sitting out on the surface. That too will help things equalize here a little bit and help things dry. I guess the higher humidity we're experiencing now that it's summertime here in my region kind of stifling the system's ability to shed its own moisture through evaporation. So the humidity is creating a probably maybe an overly saturated, overly damp air surrounding down here in the wormery. So as much as this material would like to dry by being left uncovered and exposed to the air, it seems like the drying's a little bit slow going. Might take a little patience and time, both of which I have. So for now, we're going to, I guess, bring over some of this dry stuff we scraped over. This is what we should have been blending into the damp stuff, right? So let's do one more quick till to get that much drier stuff. I could feel it as I was bringing it over, how much drier it is. I got a feeling by blending it in, it's going to help a bunch too. It'll suck up a little bit of the moisture of the surrounding stuff. It'll make all of it much easier to, there's nothing uneasy or difficult about what you see here. I think if I wanted to screen it, I probably could. For the most part, it's breaking apart. Maybe just a couple small chunks that I need to break up here and there, but very few. So the material is coming along quite nicely. I think by blending it with the dry materials that we scraped off the top, by aerating it, by continuing to leaving it uncovered, after we reset here, I think we'll just be continuing to make the material even drier and hopefully more like, I don't know, I guess something that the worms would want to consider moving out of, you know, instead of just hunkering down and being content by staying in it. So yeah, let's go ahead and set up these two halves of basically the one feeding area at this point. Just incredible how they completely trashed the cardboard that had been attempting to distinguish the feeding area, the horizontal migration feeding zone, from the rest of the material at large. And in the end, what they really accomplished was creating a batch of material that's really indistinguishable from the material at large in the bin. So they just really worked all of this through completely over the past 3 days, and 3 weeks and 1 day, 22 days. So I'm going to try to rebuild the feeding area, sort of similar to what we did last time. We've got the coffee, we've got the worm chow, we've got my regular bedding, which is going to be throughout, and on the side that we mark with the red coin will be the side that we also apply a good bit of that softer type paper to see if it results in warmer temperatures. And the time-lapse camera is going to try to observe the thermometers over time, and it should be interesting to see what we observe. So some people might consider it silly, but in my wormery it's kind of tradition to use an indicator or a divider. Not even so much of a divider, it's just a partition wall to help me see where, you know, one batch of material starts and the next one begins. So I usually try to segment the feeding areas that I'm creating from the finished castings that I'm trying to evacuate the worms from. And here I'm going to be resting the thermometers down right through these little handles of these little brackets, and I figured if I had something under the surface that could hold the thermometer down in the material, suspended down within the material rather than letting it drop to the bottom, then we might be getting a more accurate reading of temperature. So that's my partial idea for using that right there as also sort of a standoff and spacer. And I guess now that we've got a little bit of material on the horizontal migration feeding zone side, we could begin backfilling this piece of cardboard so it'll stand in position. Alright, so the coffee, you know, was not really part of the test, so it's not going to go exclusively over onto the side that we predict might go a little bit warmer because of the soft papers. The coffee does need to be spread out evenly across both sides, as will all the rest of the stuff. The only thing different should be the type of bedding that we use on that side, which is the napkins, paper towels, tissues, and stuff like that. So along those same lines, the worm chow we're going to sprinkle in is going to go across both sides evenly. And you know what? I believe I need to take a quick break because I want to throw some yummy foods down in here too. Stuff that's going to help draw worms over once again. Luckily, a lot of them are here already, but you know, we've still got quite a number on the other end too that need to be lured over as well. So I'm going to make a quick visit to the freezer, bring some stuff down to give them. I guess I'll bring this container with me. This is a good container we could use to just get some yummy foods to sweeten the deal for them. What I came up with looks pretty big and impressive, but it feels to me like it's mainly air. It's got no weight to it. Just a bunch of leaves and their stems. But either way, I think it's going to make for some pretty good stuff. And all this recycled bedding and whatever little bits of leftover food there were. Get all that stuff back in here too. And I think between a lot of this stuff removed from the freezer as it thaws, kicking off some of its moisture, it'll also help with the hydration of some of those drier bits of bedding that we used. I mean, my homemade bedding has a pretty good moisture level to it, so that's not so much the stuff that I think could utilize some extra hydration. I think it's more the stuff that we're loading in onto this opposite side. But even here you could see I had rested the coffee filter when it still had the coffee in it on top of some of these napkins, so they're already sucking in some of that coffee juice that was still in the coffee and in the filter. So some of this stuff is already dampened just from having wet stuff piled on top of it. So that's pretty cool. I guess we'll hang on to those last couple really colorful pieces to create sort of a top layer. But here I've still got a little bit of my worm chow that we can make use of. But yeah, I think we already used the last of the coffee, so that's history. So let's just sprinkle some more of this yummy stuff across. The veggies, the coffee, the worm chow, the various types of bedding, and even a little bit of extra moisture we've been pumping in here and there from time to time just to make sure it ends up becoming a nice cozy spot that the worms want to hang out in. I think it's all going to contribute to hopefully a good turnout, but only time will tell, I suppose. So we'll put these really colorful pieces out here on top. And since everything's going to be covered in plastic, at least over on this edge of the bin, I think things should be pretty interesting, hopefully. Hopefully it'll cause some good worm traffic. I guess on this side we can put the less soft, less likely to warm up paper. There again, I'm assuming the criteria for what causes certain types of paper to warm up is just their porosity or something like that. I'm not sure, you know, how airy or light the material is versus perhaps how dense other materials are. So I don't know. If anyone's got theories as to why, what was observed by that one viewer of mine who said that when they use this type of paper, they see large increases in temperature. If you have any experiences that coincide with that or even contradict that, then I'd be curious to hear them. So please leave comments along those lines below if you wish. So on this side, I guess we could even pinch in our little indicator here. Hopefully it stays put, because the only thing to go down here now is going to be the thermometer. So hopefully we can create like a little drill hole down to that cardboard roll that's right beneath most of the material that's out here. This way we can sort of nest the thermometer down into that hole, and the only thing I'll have to do once it's over in front of the camera is just orient the scale and the reading to the view of the camera so that it can see the temperature that each side of the bin is attaining at any given time. And it'll be interesting to see what the footage looks like, the time-lapse footage. So there again, kind of at the mercy of the time-lapse camera functions of the iPhone that I've got over there. It's an older one. It's an iPhone Model 5, if I believe. That's correct, yep. So luckily it's got that time-lapse capability. It's got a few gigs of space on it, so hopefully it's enough to give us some visibility into what's going on these two sides of this system over here. I guess the last finishing step is going to be to ensure that the moisture that we've got in here remains without evaporating. Evaporation on the other side, though, is something we're not worrying too much about. In fact, I believe we would benefit from seeing some, by seeing the material dry a bit, perhaps becoming a little bit less enticing for the worms to remain in, perhaps motivating them to go seeking out something a little bit better. So that'll be kind of what we're hoping for. As to whether or not it is what we get is, I guess, what remains to be seen. So I might need to tweak things here a little bit, but I believe that if I position the camera in a certain way, then I'll be able to keep an eye on the temperatures of these two bins. I'm just trying to line up the stuff that the camera's going to be seeing, but that's already feels like a waste of time. I should do it later when we're finished filming. So let me tend to those things which are not going to be part of the video, but you get what's going on here and what to expect in the next sections. So hopefully we have something to check out here. If not, then so be it. That's fine too. But at some point soon, I've also got to build a new home for these little guys, because once they start coming together on this edge of the bin, it would be nice if I had some place to put them. So that'll be on my to-do list as well. So not much more, like I said, to be done here. I'll take care of cleaning things up and putting things away, but I'm not going to waste your time. Before I go, let me really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.